So it's engine service day for the 749, and the biggest job is going to be valve clearance check. So I'm hoping everything will be in spec and we don't have to range too much of it apart, but you never know, this is why we have to check these things. So I've done an earlier Desmo Quattro engine, but I've never done a Testastretta before, so I will be learning as I go along. But I'm sure it'll all be fine. So in preparation for delving into the inner guts of the Ducati, I've been online and I found something excellent. And then I found a workshop manual on an owner's website thingy. So I have the pages printed off that are relevant. So I've got valve clearance pages, where you actually measure them, all that sort of stuff, so that's going to be useful. And I've also watched somebody else's YouTube video about changing the belts and tensioning them up. Now here's an interesting one. When you tension the belts upon this bike, they're done by harmonics. So you twang the cam belt and it goes twang, and you record it on a little device. Now the nice thing is nowadays you can get a device that you download onto your phone, which of course I would demonstrate right now, except I'm using my phone to record this, so I can't. But interestingly, I did actually do a twang check on these belts that were changed at a Ducati specialist, and they don't twang, because I'm fairly sure they're way too slack. So it's probably a good job that we're inside checking these things, because that to me is not how it should be. So I already have the covers off because I've sent all the bolts that hold the covers on to be replated because they were just not very shiny anymore. And on the other side of the bike I need to undo the little plug that allows me access to the crankshaft so I can actually turn the engine over. And then we come down here and there's a little mark here which is like the little notch that we line up this pulley, and that gives us top dead centre on the horizontal cylinder. So I'm fairly sure it's going to be this green mark will line up with that, and then the cams will line up in the cylinder head. Basically the sort of flats of these will line up that way on the cylinder head, and then we're at top dead centre, and then the clearances should be in the position where you can actually measure them. So to make it easier to turn the engine over, I'm going to take the spark plugs out, and to do that I have had to actually modify the end of one of my sockets because it wouldn't actually fit between the casting for the cylinder head and the spark plug hex before, so we'll get that down there and undo the sparky plug. There we go, because with the spark plug out, obviously the engine's not trying to compress any air, so it'll turn over easier. And because there's no actual valve springs, the engines on Ducatis actually turn over really quite easily once you've got the plugs out. So I don't have the official Ducati tool for turning the crank. So what I've got is a bolt with a nut on it and a big washer to sort of spread the load. And I've basically used that nut as a lock nut against the crankshaft. So that should hold the bolt tight. So now if I put a spanner on it, I should be able to turn the engine over. There we go, look. And because we're not compressing any valve springs, like you would on a valve spring engine, it turns over really quite easily. The only game, of course, is that the bit I need to see if I've got the engine in the right location is on the other side of the engine, and the bit I'm turning over is here. So I'll just have to turn it a little bit, go and have a look around the other side. I mean, I could get a friend to help, but that would involve having a friend, really, wouldn't it? So I've got the dot that's under all this green paint lined up with the mark in the clutch cover, and then if we go to this end, the dots on the sprockets don't line up with anything at all, but apparently they're not supposed to. The thing we're really interested in is the lines across here, across the cams, are basically in line across the sort of machined top of the crankcase, cylinder head. So I'm happy with that, and when I come to change the belts, what I'll do is I'll put little pen marks across here so that I can get it dead right where everything's going to line up. But for now we're not doing the cam belts, for now we're doing clearances. So what I need to do next is take the rocker cover off and actually get inside there with my feeler gauges. Because I've sent all my nuts away that hold the rocker cover on to be plated, this is actually loose already, though there is quite a bit of crankcase sealant because they're really prone for leaking oil out of this cover, because obviously the oil just sits in it, so if the gasket leaks even a little bit, it leaks over your oil cooler and then you think your oil cooler leaks, but it's not, it's the rocker cover every time. So before I get too carried away, we'll have a bit of cloth around there. Here we go. Give it a bit of a wiggle. There we go. Just a little bit of a wiggle needed because there's a bit on the rocker cover that sits just behind the belt there, so you have to wiggle it past there and just wiggle it past a bit at the bottom of the airbox. So now that I have my rocker cover off, I need to measure the clearance, and to do this, according to the book, I measure with a feeler gauge between the base circle of the cam, sort of when it's off cam, and the rocker arm, not between the rocker arm and the valve itself. So I need to slide the feeler gauge sort of down the gap in the back of here, and that will give me the opening lobe valve clearance, and then I have to go in between the closing rocker and the closing cam lobe to get the closing clearance, because of course, being a Desmo system, there are 2 clearances on every single one. So if we have a bit of a closer look, what I need to do is get my feeler gauge in the back of here between the rocker arm that's down there and the sort of base circle of this lobe, and that's the opening cam. And then the closing cam, because we don't use a spring to close it, we use a cam lobe to actually close the valve mechanically. That is between this big lobe and this big rocker arm here. And hopefully all of my clearances are in spec, and if they're not, I have to take the camshafts out and mess around with some shims. Right, so here we go. Opening valve clearance on the inlet. So opening lobe inlet valve is 0.18 to 0.23 millimetre. So I've got a 0.15 to begin with, which should be a relatively loose fit. So that goes in relatively easily. A 0.2 should be fairly snug. And there we go, 0.2 doesn't go in. So that tells me we're pretty much on the 0.18, because the 15's a loose fit, the 20 won't go in at all. So that lobe is in spec. So what I need to do is write that down on my diagram so I don't lose track of it all, and then move on to the next one. So next, I will measure on the same lobe, I will measure the closing clearance between this rocker arm and that lobe. So that's supposed to be, where are we? Closing rocker arm inlet, 18 to 23. So in effect, the inlet valve is always 18 to 23. So again, we'll go in with a 15. This should be a relatively easy fit. There we go, easy fit. Going with a 20. That's quite an easy fit. The 25 shouldn't fit, and it doesn't. So I'm happy that that is pretty much on the 23. So that's another one to be ticked off on the little sheet I'm filling in. So that's 2 clearances done. Only another 6 to do in this head. So it was all going swimmingly with my valve clearances until I came to do these 2. This is the closing rockers on the exhaust cam, because according to the book I have, they're supposed to be, you know, a maximum of 0.18 of a millimetre, and when I measured them they were just over 0.2, probably 0.21. So I thought, they're a little bit out, and instead of panicking too much, I decided to phone a friend. So I phoned up Gary at B&B Motorbikes in Lincoln, who is a mate of mine, and I asked him. And it turns out that I was reading the wrong page in the book, and the tolerances you build an engine to on assembly are the tolerances I was looking at. The tolerances you actually check the valve clearances to during a normal inspection, sort of a service check, the tolerances are actually bigger. On this service, the tolerances should actually be anywhere from 0.1 to 0.25 of a millimetre on all of the clearances, which makes my life considerably easier. In effect, it's Ducati saying, yeah, we would like a tighter clearance, but if it move a little bit, you do not worry. But they probably say it in actual Italian. So there you go. The front cylinder is done, and they are intolerant. So I'm just going to loosely put the rocker cover back on because I don't actually have any bolts to hold it down yet, and move on to the vertical cylinder. So I want to take the airbox lid off because it will give me easier access into the rocker cover, because I can move these fuel pipes out of the way, and I've got less likelihood of dropping anything, sort of any dirt or anything, into the cylinder head. But the screws that go around the outside aren't too bad. The one that sits up here in the front has a frame rail right above it, so you can't actually get a screwdriver on it. So this may have got out of hand. To begin with, all I wanted to do was move 2 fuel pipes so it was slightly easy to get into a rocker cover, and then because I realised the airbox top half screws were difficult to access, I thought it may never have been off and may not be particularly clean inside. And then it turns out you can't actually get the airbox lid off with the airbox in the bike, so you've got to take the airbox off. But you can't get the airbox straight up because it hits the ignition switch, so I've taken that off, and it couldn't go backwards because of that brace in the frame. And of course the throttle cables are attached to it, and the only bit of the design that is actually thoughtful is there's a quick release connector for all the electrics that go into the airbox. So down here on the floor is the airbox with the throttle cables and the sort of fast idle choke cable, as you'd call it, the fuel lines and bits, and inside there are the throttle bodies and everything. And the only time I've known an airbox be anywhere near as awkward as this was when I was doing a 1290 Super Duke KTM. And that was also an absolute pain. So I'm guessing the man who designed this, who hopefully was fired from Ducati straight afterwards, then probably went to work at KTM, where hopefully he's been fired, because this is just horrendous. It's taken me longer to take the airbox off the bike than it has to strip basically all the other bits off it. It's ridiculous. So to do the vertical cylinder, the back cylinder, what I've done is I've set the cams so that they're sort of, the lines across here are in line with the top of the cylinder head, so that this is top dead centre on the combustion stroke, so all the valves are closed. It's taken me about 2 minutes to check all the clearances now that I actually have access to everything, so that's all tickety-boo. So I've given the airbox a clean inside and out, and I've cleaned inside sort of the V of the engine that you can't normally get to. So that's it. Just need to pop this back in the hole now. So if you ever make the mistake of taking out the airbox of your 749 or 999 and you need to put it back in, this is how you do it. You have to bolt the top to the bottom first, because not only that one screw right at the front that's really awkward, there's 2 more that are sort of just behind this frame rail here that you won't get to with the airbox in the bike, and you'll have the ignition barrel off as well, and then you just sort of drop the airbox into the hole, feed the throttle cables, so we'll go back up here, feed the throttle cables through the gaps in the frame up there so they route correctly back towards they're supposed to be, and then I've sprayed a bit of spray lube on the sort of collars there, on the throttle bodies that drop into the inlet rubbers, so that one in there, the one at the back, and then I'm just going to get everything lined up and give it a bit of a shove. So I'm getting somewhere now. The airbox and everything is clean and it's refitted. The ignition barrel's back on. The cables for the throttle and for the sort of fast idle choke thing are all reconnected in happy days. The little bit of wiring under there is connected. The breathers off the airbox are not connected yet because I need them off for putting some of the bolts back on that I took off to get plated and getting the radiators on and all that sort of stuff, so we don't need to worry about those yet. So yeah, the next thing really is cam belts. I've been shopping, and my shopping is very much in the man style because I've come back with motorbike bits. So, I have a set of genuine Ducati cam belts, and these were from B&B's in Lincoln, and then we also have a good quality butt pattern oil filter, some NGK spark plugs, and some pipe across air filters to replace the ones that are in the bike. The ones that are in it aren't too bad, but these are nice and clean and they're fresh and they're not going to fall apart, so, it'll be a proper job. So right, the first job is cam belts. And that can seem quite daunting, but I don't really see why. Because they're only really just elastic bands with some teeth on. So Gary round at B&B's has been doing Ducatis for a good few years now, and I showed him the tension, or should we probably say lack of tension, on these Ducati belts, and he was not amused, shall we say, because they're clearly not the 110 Hz twanginess that they should be. So that's not really very good, and he had a theory, because you can buy little tools that go between the teeth here that lock everything in place for when you take the belt off, so nothing moves. But he said the problem with that is it might lock these in place, but it doesn't allow any movement for the slack on the rest of the belt to sort of sit right. So he said you might get the tension right in one bit of the belt, but it won't be the right tension everywhere else if these are locked in place. Right, so I've reset the cam timing so that we've got the sort of little indent there in line with the mark on the crankcase, and these lines are across here. But what I'm also going to do is I'm going to put a little pen mark on these on the outside so I know which way's sort of up and down, pointing towards the flat of the cylinder head. So we'll put a little mark on here again. So that's definitely lined up there, and then this one wants to be just there. That one wants to be just there. So there we go, we've got paint pen marks there and there, and I'm only marking them on the outsides so that you can't get the cam 180 degrees out. I've got my mark down here on the sort of crank pulley bit, and then I've got marks on the vertical head, the horizontal head as well. So now I can undo these, which means I need a big spanner to hold the hex behind it, and a little spanner, 13mm, to undo that. Or at least I think it's 13mm. Find out in a second. So it turns out that this hex here is 26mm, and I don't actually have a 26mm spanner because I've never needed one before. But what I do have is a good quality adjustable spanner. So what I can do is I can hold the hexagon with that, and then I can get my 12mm socket or spanner onto that and loosen it off a bit. There we go, that's that undone. It was plenty tight enough. And then what we can do with that is wind as much slack into it as possible. So about there, and then at that point we should be able to unhook the cam belt because it should have a load of slack in it. So it's still not exactly falling off, which is probably a good thing, but it will come off. There we go, one belt off. Right, that is the belts off, and this is obviously the terribly scary situation that if I touch anything at all, much disaster could happen, like if I get hold of this one and wiggle it around. Oh no, how would I know how to reset it? Well, it's easy, I'll just put the line back in line. So, there you go. Right, the next thing I'm going to do before I put the new belts on is I'm going to give all these a spin and a wobble, make sure they're nice and solid, make sure there's no play in that pulley there, that's okay, and I'm actually going to take these off and make sure there's no dirt and bits behind the rollers, because my friendly Ducati man round at B&B's told me to do that, because he's nice like that, giving me all the trade secrets. I've got the sort of tensioning pulley off. This one moves nice and freely. I've cleaned up on the shaft, and this moves nice and freely, and there's, you know, no excessive play or anything in that. So I can slide that back on there, leave it in the loose position. Some of them have a little spacer behind here apparently, that, you know, you don't want to lose, but this doesn't have it. Depends on the year and what bike and all the rest of it. So now I can put the washer back on the front and get my nut on, and then I can actually start putting the belts on once I've done the other one of those, of course. Right then, it is now time to put the new belts on. So what I need to do with these is feed one in from the top here and down behind here, slip it onto the pulley that's connected to the crank, slip that down there, and then we can slip it onto the cam sprockets. Right, so that's the belt loosely on the vertical cylinder, and as I put it onto here, I pull it like reasonably tight on this side to make sure the teeth on this sprocket are in the right place, and we are lined up, the white line's in the right place, and then again fairly tight to get this one on, which is in the right place, because if you do it the other way around and keep this side tight, you might end up with these at the wrong angle, and then when you tension it up, it all moves. So I'd always pull it onto this one first, because this one's, you know, not going to move, and then in effect, because this is the side that you take the slack out of, it's the side you'd build it with the slack in when you're putting it together. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense. Right, the next thing to do is to get my spanner on here, give it a little spin round, get a reasonable amount of tension on it, and just nip it that one up while I put this one on. So now I need to put this one on, so I'm going to feed it onto the sort of crank pulley first, feed it round this one, over the first one first, and then back this way, so that the slack is this side. There. Right, so that's in there. And in fact, if I even pull that with my finger, so I pull that sort of tight before I even do the pulley up, we can see that that line's in line, that line's in line. So I'm happy that my belt is on the correct teeth. So in fact, if I get hold of this, spin this anti-clockwise, and if I hold it there, you can even hear the twang a little bit. So I'll just put a little bit of a nip on that. So my next job is to twang my belt like that, and that should be 110 Hertz, but my hearing isn't that well dialed into 110 Hertz, so I'm going to use my phone because my phone's got an app on it for checking the tension, but I'm also using my phone for videoing this, so you'll just have to excuse me for a minute while I go and twang my belt. Right, after a little bit of tweaking, I think we've got this pretty good. That apparently is 112 to 113 Hertz, having given several attempts. My first attempt was just over 120, I slackened it off and I was down to about 103, and I got it in the middle, and after a couple of little detailed tweaks, that apparently is within tolerance 110 Hertz, so that's happier days. And compared to how I found the belts when I first took the covers off, those are considerably tighter, which makes me considerably happier. So, Nutty's torqued up to 25 Newton meters. This belt's done. Time to move on to that belt. Right, I'm now happy with my belt tension on both cylinders. I got it so that I'm in the plus or minus 5 Hertz range of the 110 on both belts, and then I've turned the engine over a couple of times and I've double checked that my timing marks are all still in the right place, and I've gone around and twanged my belts a little bit more, and everything's coming back as in range again, so I'm happy with that. In the coming days I may borrow the proper Ducati tool and actually see how reliable my phone is compared to the Ducati tool, but for now I think we can say that is job done on the belt change. I might just pop the spark plugs in for tonight and that'll do it. Happy days. So I've popped the new spark plugs in, and I thought one last real quick job is to change the air filters. So these are the ones that came out that they're okay, they're a little bit dirty inside, but that is the dirty side, so it's not the end of the world. But I thought, you know what, it's having a big service, it can have some new air filters. So we're getting rid of those ones and we're fitting pipe across, sort of washable ones. So in effect, these, once they've got dirty after, a few thousand miles, they can be taken out, cleaned, so you never actually have to buy any new air filters. So I should just slip these in the holes, and then in effect the sort of combustion side of the engine is all sealed up, and I can go home happy. Obligatory sticker stuck to the airbox so the next person actually knows that they don't have to throw the air filters away and they can clean them, and I'd say that was pretty good. I'm really quite pleased with how today went, because I've never really worked on one of these Testastretta engines before, and I will admit it can be quite daunting to go and work on something new because you never know what you're going to find. But realistically, this is easier than a Desmo Quattro motor to do work on, because the access in the rocker covers and bits is easier. It's, not a bad thing to work on. It's definitely not Japanese, but we can't hold that against it. I quite like an Italian. And on that note, I might go home and have a bit of pasta for me tea. Thanks for watching, and join me again next time for some more work on the Ducati.